Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me properly. I want to thank Elisa, Ariana, Marisol for this invitation, and want to thank all of you for being virtually with me today. As the title of this presentation indicates, I'm going to try to cover a very pressing and at the same time challenging question, because there have been a lot of debates on whether we're still living under capitalism or not, or to what extent, what's new, what's different. And I'm going to introduce you to the way I've been analyzing this question and more generally global dynamics within capitalism from a political economy perspective, also from an economics of innovation perspective, which is basically the two main backgrounds that I have. And I would like to start with some stylized facts, but before that, just to give you a brief outline of the presentation today, after these stylized facts that will attempt to drive your attention into things that I've been interested in, such as the concentration of intangible assets, I'm going to take a small detour to rediscuss monopoly theory with you, and I hope it will be a good starting point to understand the relevance of intellectual monopolies, which are the focus of my research. And from that, I will move to a very paradigmatic case, at least special or specific in some respects, which is the case of big tech companies, and how they are expanding both to other sectors and how they are expanding their network of domination through cloud computing. So the presentation will have both some theoretical discussions, but at the same time, I will try to cover quite a few very topical discussions, and that I hope you will be interested in. So let's start with let me see if I can go to the next. Yeah, let's start, as I said, with some stylized facts. And these stylized facts will be focused on what's going on at the corporate level. So most of my presentation will be focused on what's going on in particular with leading corporations. And what we see, first of all, is that there has been a concentration of profits within companies. So if we only look at the share of value that companies are capturing, we will see not only that it's increasing vis-a-vis workers and vis-a-vis the rest, but also that within the share of value that companies capture, there is also a concentration process. And if we want to dig deeper and try to understand what are the companies that are concentrating more profits, one thing that we will notice is that those companies that are intensive in digital sectors or those companies that are in digital intensive sectors will tend to have higher markups. And more broadly, that the leading companies in the world, if we make a comparison between the top 500 companies in market capitalization in the mid-70s and nowadays, one first stylized fact that we will notice is that in the 1970s, they were highly tangible based. So they had more machines and factories, whereas nowadays they are heavily intangible asset based. And just another stylized fact that reinforces this same point is that the 60% of the total IP5 patents between 2014 and 2016 are in the hands of only 2,000 corporations. The IP5 patents are inventions that were patented in the 5 largest patent offices, and it's one of the indicators one can have of the quality of a patent, because there are a lot of discussions about whether what is being patented is actually an innovation or not. So a way to try to proxy that is with IP5 patents. And there is also, when we look at some stylized facts on the differences between companies, and we can also look at differences in terms of sectors. And when we focus on sectors, we see that most of the business expenditure on R&D is being concentrated in basically 2, eventually 3 sectors if we consider the automobile industry as well, but mostly ICT, both hardware and software. So I'm including here all the digital technology, platform companies, and so on. And after the ICT comes the healthcare sector, and in a distant third place, the automobile industry. So we are seeing higher dispersion or stratification of firms, some firms that are becoming stronger and that keep on occupying the lead or top positions in market capitalization, in terms of profits, in terms of revenues. And when we look at these firms, they are intensive in intangible assets. So we can focus, for instance, on evolutions of figures like this one, where basically what we see is not only that the leading firms are more intensive in intangible assets, but also that the relevance of intangible assets has grown over time. This is, again, only one among the many intangible assets we could be looking at, which is both applied and granted patents. And what I'm interested in looking at by, for instance, introducing patents is, okay, we have more and more patents in the last decades, but it's not just patenting more, it's that these leading companies are consistently patenting more and concentrating a larger share of all the patents that are both applied and granted. So on the left side of the screen, what you have is the list of all the companies that appeared at least once in the ranking of top 20 patent assignees in the US Patent and Trademark Office between 2011 and 2020. So these are the companies that were patenting the most in the US in more or less the last decade. And you can clearly see in total, we have 33 companies in 10 years in the top 20. So a quite stable set of companies always appearing in these top positions in terms of patenting. But not just that, 8 among them appeared every single year. So this starts giving you, as stylized facts, some ideas on where I'm heading to. I'm heading to an explanation of corporate power as explained by the concentration of intangible assets. But as I said before, patents are only one among the many intangible assets. And of course, you can think of other intellectual property rights, like copyrights, like designs that are also patented, and so on and so forth. But it's not only, and perhaps nowadays in some sectors, not mainly about intellectual property rights, but also about a lot of knowledge and data that is kept secret. So there are different ways in which an organization can transform a portion of knowledge into an asset. One way is by relying on intellectual property rights. But another way is by keeping it secret and preventing others from accessing that knowledge and using that knowledge in a privileged way to produce things that then will be sold in the market. And just as examples, for instance, in where secrecy is extremely important is in the digital sector. Not only, of course, all the big data that leading companies from this sector have are kept secret, but also the most advanced algorithms. And if you're thinking, hey, but we all have access to, let's say, ChatGPT, we have access to the product, but we don't have access to the code. And as I will explain afterwards in the presentation, we're actually contributing to the R&D process of OpenAI and Microsoft by using ChatGPT. So the main takeaway of this stylized facts, and the main takeaway actually of, I think, my whole presentation is summarized in this slide, and which basically what I will try to show you with both my theoretical understandings and my empirical research is that nowadays all forms of knowledge and information are increasingly being monopolized, and that this is the main source of corporate power in contemporary capitalism. So how can we approach this discussion? So what I've been proposing in my research, So what I've been proposing in my research is to speak of leading corporations as intellectual monopolies. And you may say, hey, but why monopolies? And there are several examples that show us that these leading corporations, more often than not, do not operate in what we would think of a typical monopoly market. They're not the single players offering in a market. There are several examples, some are on the slide, and the case of Amazon is quite interesting because Amazon was not even profitable for many years, and when it is barely profitable. So it's not only that one could say that it has a lot of rivals that can go from Alibaba or Mercado Libre in terms of marketplaces, but also when it sells in its marketplace, it has a lot of competition of third-party players. But also, one would expect a monopoly to be at least more profitable than other companies in similar or close sectors. And this is not happening in the case of Amazon, for instance, which is one of the top companies in market capitalization and one of the examples I've been studying of intellectual monopoly. So why am I saying this? We could move to examples, and I could give you this and many more examples where leading corporations indeed operate pretty much like a market monopoly. And it's not only the case of Microsoft Windows with it, and also the Office package, but also Google search engine is a clear example of a company that is, or a product that is pretty much operating in a monopoly market. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg, and this is not the type of monopoly I'm more interested in. Nonetheless, most of the economics and the social sciences literature in general thinks of monopolies as single companies operating in a market, as single sellers in a market. So the first thing we need to do to try to understand what intellectual monopolies are is to rethink of monopoly theory. And to do that, I'm going back to a definition that was provided by a general attorney centuries ago, the Attorney General of England and Wales, when he was saying a monopoly is an institution or allowance by the king by his grand commission or otherwise to any person or persons, body politic or corporate, of or for the sole buying, selling, making, working, or using of anything, whereby any person or persons, body politic or corporate, are sought to be restrained of any freedom or liberty that they had before or hindered in their lawful trade. And there are two important things in this quote that I want to highlight. The first one is already highlighted in pink and refers to the types of monopolies that we may have. We may think of the typical example as a monopoly for the selling. The monopsony of the economics literature is a monopoly for the sole buying. But we can also have a monopoly for the making and the working, and those are the type of monopolies that I'm more interested in. And we can also have a monopoly for the using, for the consumption. And there is another part of this quote that is interesting and that was forgotten in our contemporary understanding of a monopoly, which is that monopolies are a social relation of power, where the fact that there is one organization that monopolizes something at the same time means that others will be restrained, will be deprived from that access. So with this in mind, we can go actually to the idea of property rights and remember that property rights are not a relationship between a person and a thing, but actually a relationship between people. And that includes also fictive persons. So that includes also organizations. And with this idea of property rights in mind, we clearly understand the way in which the previous quote was thinking of monopolies as a power relation. But this power relation will be different depending on the type of monopoly power that is exercised. As I was mentioning before, there can be monopolies for the consumption, exclusive consumption of something. I come from Argentina, so let's say that I buy a property in the south of the country. That property has it's a piece of land that has a lake. And from that moment onwards, nobody else, except for my friends, my family, so people that have personal relationships with me, can swim in that lake or do whatever they want in that lake. Before, if it was a public piece of land, everyone could have just taken a swim there. I'm limiting others from consuming, but I'm not accumulating with my lake unless I start charging a fee to authorize people to go and swim in my lake. This is the first distinction that one can make when we think of exclusive access to, in this case, part of nature, as it is the case of the lake. When we focus on accumulation and the monopoly power relationships, we can also distinguish two broad types of monopoly power relations. One is what can be defined as an interclass monopoly relation, and very simple, workers are deprived from the means of production, whereas capitalists own the means of production, and therefore capitalists have a monopoly over the means of production in their relationship with workers. But we can also think of intra-class monopoly relations, and this is where my research is focusing on. In particular, in the intra-class monopoly relations between different types of firms. And here again, we need to dig deeper and make more distinctions. In this case, different types of or different forms of monopoly power, depending on the type of or the different means of production that is being monopolized. In most of the cases, monopolizing, let's say, a crucial resource for producing will deprive all the other firms that need that resource from accessing it freely, and will give me, if I'm exercising that monopoly, the privilege to charge them more to get access to that resource. For instance, in Argentina, the paper that is used for newspapers is owned only by the two largest newspaper companies, and they own it together, and they charge the price they want to all the other potential newspapers, because and of course, this is a crucial resource to have a newspaper printed. But as you can see with this example, the effect of this monopoly power is quite limited. It's limited only to those that are selling newspapers. Whereas if we think of monopolizing knowledge, since knowledge is not only a non-rival product, which means that if I'm using knowledge, if I'm consuming knowledge, at the same time as other people, none of us will be affected by that. We will still be consuming the same knowledge altogether without depriving each other. It's not like an apple, where if we want to all eat the same apple, we cannot do it. We eventually will need to eat a piece of the apple. But in the case of knowledge, this non-rivalness enables us to consume it all together at the same time without diminishing our satisfaction from that consumption. It's not only this the case of knowledge, but actually when we consume knowledge, when we use it, when we mobilize knowledge, what we are doing is producing more knowledge. So we build more knowledge by consuming it. And since knowledge can be used by everyone at the same time, when knowledge is appropriated, as in the case of these intellectual monopolies that I'm going to describe to you, the effect of that monopolization becomes a form of global exclusion. Knowledge is used in every single production process. Knowledge is used for everything that we do in our everyday life, different forms of knowledge, from less to more advanced, and also from scientific or technological forms of knowledge to other types of knowledge, local knowledge based on experience, on learning, by using, doing, interacting. So there are many types of knowledge that can be potentially monopolized, and their effects will be similar. So this is the type of monopoly power relation I'm interested in. And one could say, okay, but there have been cases of intellectual monopolies throughout history. And you have some examples there on the slide already, even of companies, leading corporations of what can be conceptualized as industrial capitalism era. So the first part of, or after the First World War, in particular, since the Second World War, we can think of some companies that were already intellectual monopolies, even though what I will try to argue, there was a difference between the moment of General Electric or Bell Labs and what we are looking at today, which can be defined as a new moment, a new era within capitalism that can be called intellectual monopoly capitalism, whereas it's not just some examples of leading corporations or some examples in specific places of intellectual monopolies, but the whole capital accumulation dynamic being explained by a systematic, expanding, permanent monopolization of portions of society's intangibles that are being transformed into the assets of a few firms. And what I will try to argue is that this knowledge, this information that is being appropriated is not mainly being produced inside these firms. Because there is a big idea or confusion, actually, that these firms that innovate so much in principle deserve to have more profits because they are investing in this new knowledge, they are creating this new knowledge. And if we stop investing and if we stop accepting that they will have higher profits, we say, okay, no, this shouldn't be the case, then there will be no more innovation. And what I will try to show you is that actually the co-producers of knowledge, the co-producers of information are a lot, hundreds, thousands of organizations, whereas those profiting from innovation are just a few. I'm not claiming that leading corporations are not conducting innovation. What I will try to show you in the rest of this presentation is that they contribute to innovations, but that they do so together with a lot of other organizations that are left aside when it comes to profiting from this new knowledge. So how did we end up here? And I will try to go very briefly into these discussions and just give you a whole slide since the very beginning. So I'm not trying to establish here any form of causality, but actually to discuss a brief genealogy of intellectual monopoly capitalism by introducing its different dimensions and how they reinforce each other. On one way, we can focus on how knowledge is produced. So we produce knowledge on the basis of existing knowledge, as I was discussing before, and this leads to a process of cumulative causation. However, to produce knowledge, we need to have the sufficient background. We need to understand. Those of you sitting at your classroom today, first of all, understand English. Second, even before that, you know how to read, how to write. You have a lot of economics, management background, and so on and so forth. So you're capable of understanding what I'm saying because you've been developing certain absorptive capacities that enable you to understand my talk. Whereas if I would be speaking, let's say, about quantum computing, you would probably be completely lost because you don't have the sufficient absorptive capacities. So you have not learned in the past what is needed to understand what someone giving a lecture on quantum computing will be saying. And in the case of organizations, you also have this idea of a translation capacity or management capacity to transform, to translate different forms of knowledge into knowledge that is useful for the accumulation of more value by the firm. So if we think of these types of capacities together, it's quite clear that the organization that has innovated, that has had a success and introduced a new technique, has introduced a new product to a market, and so on and so forth, will be better prepared because it's already at the knowledge frontier. So it will be better prepared to keep absorbing from the environment new knowledge, to keep producing with the environment, with other organizations, more knowledge, and transform as well that knowledge into valuable innovations for the firm. If you think about all this process together, what I'm trying to say is that the winners of the innovation race will remain always the same, and the rest of the industries will always be laggards, will always be catching up, but at not just in a process of firm one innovates and then the rest catches up, and then firm one innovates again and then the rest catches up, but actually firm one innovates, then firm one innovates again, then perhaps you start seeing some catching up but still lagging, and firm one keeps innovating and innovating. So it's a process that needs to be self-reinforced to lead to firms' technological differentiation, to lead to a process of stratification between firms. This is a possibility. It seems likely, but it's still a possibility. What made it the prevalent way in which innovation takes place in contemporary capitalism, at least in the leading sectors that are concentrating most of the R&D investment, is more, it needs to be explained not only by this possibility, but also by the other factors, including the higher cost of doing R&D is more and more expensive as time passes by to do new, a whole set of institutional and political transformations without which it would be harder, at least, even if not to some extent impossible, to constantly capture intangible assets. So one of them, of course, as you may probably know, is the international intellectual property rights regime, the establishment of an intellectual property rights regime at the international level, and that it's more stringent and that protects more types of things than what was protected before the 1980s. So from the 1980s onwards, there have been a whole set of new expansions, different acts originally in the US and then at the global level that enable to patent things that before could not be patented or protected with intellectual property rights, like lines of code, algorithms, like living beings. It's not only about what could be protected with an intellectual property right, but also about the length of the intellectual property rights. But on top of these transformations and on top of the role of US multinational corporations in pushing for these transformations, we can actually trace the establishment of an intellectual property rights regime not only from 1980s onwards, but way back in history to the late 19th century, when workplace knowledge stopped being the property of the employee of the worker and became the property of the firm. And there were also a whole set of transformations, of legal transformations in the US and in the UK as well, that enabled this. On top of that, there were also other transformations, in particular in the late 70s onwards. Among them, I would just highlight the hidden industrial policy in the United States. The United States, by channeling a lot of funding through DARPA and other agencies, ended up picking certain sectors and winners that ended up in part explaining the emergence of companies like big tech nowadays and also big pharma from the US. And if we think of industrial policy, it was certainly not hidden in cases such as those of China recently and before Japan and Korea. And the fourth thing that needed to make intellectual monopoly capitalism the prevalent way of capital nowadays were technological changes themselves. ICT technologies enable to modularize the production of new knowledge, so divide the production of knowledge in different pieces that can be conducted in different parts of the world, and you can still have a leading corporation controlling, overseeing the whole process by using internet and other ICT technologies. You also have the possibility to find in an extremely never existing such fast way what's going on in every part of the world. If there are new developments, new things coming, you can just Google and find out about them. And this favors those that are already at the frontier with the largest absorptive capacities, because they will identify very quickly the new developments that are taking place in parts of the world. And there is one technology in particular that has changed things, and this is machine learning, in particular deep learning neural networks, as a new method of invention. Because when data is processed with deep learning technologies, with machine learning technologies, what happens is that the algorithms themselves learn and get better. So we are having means of that get better the more we use them. And this leads us precisely to the question of why are big tech the most extreme case of an intangible? Because these companies, as I will show you in a couple of slides, are monopolizing this new method of invention, which basically consists of finding new data sources, creating new data sources, collecting them, and analyzing them with algorithms that, as I said before, self-adjust, and become better the more we use them. This means that they are production, that instead of depreciating the value the more we use them, their value appreciates the more we use them. So they're significantly different to any that we've seen before, and contribute to a process of non-stop innovation, if you want to think it in those terms. So there is a continuous flow of innovation when we have companies collecting all the time, at every second, more and more data. And this concentration of data and the capacity to analyze the data in fewer hands leads to what Jack Ma, the founder and CEO of Alibaba, anticipates as leading us finally to a planned economy. The question is, who's planning the economy? Who has the capacity to analyze what's going on in big portions of global capitalism and influence and organize production? And what we will see is that these are big tech companies. And this is why we can call them data-driven intellectual monopolies, because not the whole set, but the core of their lead is explained precisely by this capacity to monopolize the data value chain. Okay, so as I was saying, when we speak of planning, one could go back and say, operations always end, and they did so inside the factory. There was this idea of the pin factory, or any factory, as organized labor, where what each worker was supposed to do was organized within a larger structure that was the planning of the production process as a whole. At the other end, the other way in which we organize labor, the other form of division of labor within capitalism, it's the market itself. And in principle, the market is an arena where everyone can offer whatever they want, and nobody's telling each other what to do. So in principle, planning is absent from the market. Markets are a social relation that is opposed to planning. planning inside the frontier or the front door of the firm, and outside we have the market relation. But what we are actually seeing is a process where what we could say is that planning is moving, and you will see this in 1 second, planning is moving beyond the frontiers of the factory. Planning is no longer concentrated inside the corporation, but actually leaving companies that are intellectual monopolies because they have exclusive access, or in some cases privileged access to knowledge and data that is not only indispensable for their own production processes, but also for production processes that others conduct. This privileged access to knowledge would enable them to plan, to organize production beyond their legally owned assets. And that's why here I am plotting a picture of Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, inside a Foxconn factory in China. Foxconn is one of the companies that assembles the iPhone. But global value chains, as have been widely studied, as in the case of Apple, are only one among them in which hold intellectual monopolies can organize and plan. And if we go back to relation, a social power relation, what am I meaning by this? Is precisely this, is this capacity to organize, use monopolized knowledge to organize and plan other companies that now are the companies deprived from access to knowledge. And now that you can see the slide, I continue. Global value chains, as I was saying, are only one of the different ways this can be done. Intellectual monopolies also control and organize production as well as innovation in other ways. And you have some examples over there. The franchising model operates under the same principles. Platforms also operate under the same principles. The idea is that the leading corporation that holds an intellectual monopoly will have the capacity to strategically decide what it will outsource and what it will keep in-house. And among the things that can be outsourced, if we're speaking about outsourcing steps of the production of new commodities, new products and services, then we can think that the monopoly relation, a monopoly relationship that is based on this monopolization of intangibles, will be used for organizing what can be called as an accumulation or production subsystem. So we want to put a name, let's frame it, to put a name to all the types of structures these companies plan. So the franchising model, the platforms, the global value chains, some companies actually plan them all. And you can think, for instance, of Apple as an example of a company that has both platforms and has a global value chain. You can think of Amazon as a company that has global value chains, for instance, for manufacturing all the products that are Amazon basics, and for many other things, but at the same time, it operates platforms. And then you have cases of like McDonald's that has a franchising model, but also organizes global values at the same time. So all these different structures considered together for the production of new products and services sold in markets can be considered or comprised under this umbrella of production subsystems that are planned, organized by a company that is holding and exercising their intellectual monopoly. But as I was saying before, these companies not only use their intellectual monopolies to subordinate companies that are part of this production or accumulation subsystems, but also outsource portions of the innovation process. And when they do so, they still do it controlling or seeing the innovation process itself. And this is what I try to explain with the term corporate innovation system. So a corporate innovation system will typically be usually global, and I will, with an example, I will show you what I mean by global. So it has participation, it sees participation from organizations that are spread around the world, but still with certain clear hubs for the production of innovation. And this innovation system, unlike the national innovation system, for instance, which is set inside a country, and typically one could think that the state has an articulator role In the corporate innovation system, it's the leading corporation, the intellectual monopoly, the one that organizes, that controls the intellectual monopoly, although there are several other organizations participating, such as startup companies and other innovating companies, of course, universities, public research organizations, NGOs, and so on. What do I mean by planning, controlling the innovation system? I mean that the intellectual monopoly defines the general R&D orientations, defines what will the priorities be. Of course, there is always a degree of openness, of autonomy, and because otherwise it would be impossible to produce new knowledge. It's impossible to anticipate a creative process completely in advance, but it's possible to steer it according to certain objectives that are those of the company holding the intellectual monopoly. And the other part where we see the power relation is where we look at who's profiting from the new knowledge that is being created all together. So they co-produce knowledge, but most of the associated profits are kept by the intellectual monopoly. And this is why we can speak of a knowledge predatory relationship. And what I want to do in the rest of the presentation is give you very briefly some examples of what I've been saying, but focusing on the tech sector. As I said before, this is not only an analysis of the tech sector, and I could be showing you the same thing for a big pharma company, for instance, for Siemens or other companies as well. I'm focusing on the tech sector because I want to discuss with you some key issues about the cloud and why that's important. But again, this is a more general understanding of what underpins the power of leading corporations. What you can see here is a network mapping of co-authorships. Leading corporations that invest in R&D not only patent, not only have other intellectual property rights, and not only keep secret part of the knowledge they develop, but they also publish papers, like academics. And when they publish papers, they give us a very important piece of information related to who they are working with. When we look at the co-authorships, we can see which are, in this case, Microsoft most frequent co-authors, and it can be used as a proxy for a corporate innovation system. Who's working with Microsoft and in which projects, and who are the different organizations working together, and therefore that can be grouped in clusters at the same time with Microsoft and among them. But we have some extra piece of information if we compare the networks of co-authorships and total co-authorships with co-ownership of patents. Because when we look at the share of co-author publications, for instance, from Microsoft, you can see on the table that is almost 90% of the papers had at least one co-author that was from a different organization. So in a way, we could say that almost 90% of the research that is being conducted by Microsoft is also done by other organizations. Whereas when we look at the share of co-owned patents, in the case of Microsoft, this is only 1% for the same period of time. And also you have some info there about the countries that are represented in Microsoft publications, as well as the cities. And this gives you some idea of why I was referring to this locality of corporate innovation systems. So there is still quite a lot of concentration in terms of specific hubs, but a wide representation of countries at the same time. If we move to what's that research about, what's Microsoft actually working on? And now I'm not only speaking about Microsoft, but I also wanted to bring to your attention the fact that big tech companies in general, even though they come from the originally different sectors or businesses, they have been under a process of technological convergence. In particular, some of them, and you have some of the big tech companies on the slide. And what I've done here in the book that we wrote together with Professor Lundvall is to do a text mining, a semantic analysis, automatic analysis. So it's not me cherry picking the terms, but actually identifying from each of these companies' publications between 2014 and 2019, which were the most frequent keywords. And what you can clearly see on top of the technological convergence is that that technological convergence is on machine learning, deep neural networks. And of course, this technology works when you're also at the same time getting not only the algorithms, but also the data. And this is why the terms highlighted in blue refer to data sets, and the terms highlighted in green refer to the technology, whereas the terms highlighted in yellow refer to the functional applications, what they are doing in concrete, what they're applying machine learning to. if one could say, okay, this is only the companies just focusing on AI, it's clear, but still the AI agenda or the AI field is wide open. There are many other organizations doing research in artificial intelligence. So, okay, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and so on are concentrating their R&D in artificial intelligence, but that's why, and one other thing that I have shown you in the previous slides, and they're doing this research with many other organizations that then are not patenting with them. So there is a form of knowledge predation already. But actually the effect is way larger, and it's way larger because if you look at the slide that I'm projecting at the moment, that shows you which are the organizations that are presenting more often at the leading AI conferences. This is the top 14 AI conferences in the world between 2018 and 2020. And this is the network of the top 150 organizations presenting their work there. And you can clearly see in this square over here, you have Alphabet here, so Google, you have Facebook here, Amazon is over here, and Microsoft is here. These companies, and there are also Chinese companies on this side, like Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance is also on the map. So these companies are not only part of the network, these companies are shaping the network. They are the core nodes of the network, in particular, Alphabet and Microsoft. These two companies have what in network analysis is called the highest betweenness centrality. It's a measure of how central a node is in a network. So it's a way to highlight the power of these companies in shaping the network. And this network is the AI field. It's the leading AI research agenda that then is trickling down and influencing all the AI research that is being done in the world. What is even more important is the role of Microsoft. I don't know if how good you can see the slide, but just to explain it to you, these clusters over here, the red clusters on the right-hand side, are clusters that mostly have Chinese organizations, both firms, universities, the Chinese Science and Technology Academy, whereas all the other clusters that are on the left side of the network are mostly Western clusters, which means that Microsoft, in this key bridging position, is basically connecting the AI research between China, that's been done in China, with the AI research that it's done in the rest of the world. So this is a form of intellectual monopolization that is way larger to concentrating a lot of patents. This is basically two companies in particular, 4 or 5, setting a whole research field, defining what's important, the ways in which AI research should be conducted. And this has as a consequence several effects at market levels. In particular, I want to focus on the cloud market, but I don't want to speak for much longer. So I will just go very, very briefly on 2-3 slides on the cloud and perhaps skip the rest so that we have more time for Q&A. In principle, one could say that the cloud is just another market, and it's another marketplace where what is offered are things that before were running in local computers. So software is being offered as a service through internet. Platforms are offered as a service also through the internet, and the same with infrastructure, storage, processing power. And in particular, for the case of AI, things that are offered are standardized databases to train the algorithms, some AI models, pieces of AI models, and also the specific processors, the GPUs that are needed to run these highly demanding algorithms in terms of processing power, as well as to store data. And clients typically will be paying according to what they use. And one of the things that was highlighted very early is that although you pay only for what you use and the entering fees are low, the exiting fees are high and lock customers in. And another thing that was identified quite soon was that it was a key window for big tech companies to anticipate which type of third-party players were offering services on their clouds, because it's not only the companies offering directly their own software as a service, for instance, but also smaller companies that offer as a service their own software. There are many so-called partners that are offering as a service their products using the cloud of Amazon, Google, and Microsoft in particular. So this enables companies like Amazon or Microsoft, for instance, to anticipate cases where there are services that are working very good, that are sold all the time again and again, and try to copy them and displace these other companies from their marketplace, or acquire the companies, as it was the case of Nuance and Microsoft, whereas the Elasticsearch and Kibana example belongs to Amazon, and Amazon displays the rival. So far, this is pretty much the same story of Amazon's typical marketplace. One could say, okay, there is a difference. The first difference is that this is a highly concentrated market. Between Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, in that order, they concentrate 65% of the market. And this is actually a quite conservative estimate. But this is not what I'm more interested in. What I'm more interested in is the effect that cloud computing has in reinforcing, on the one hand, intellectual monopolies, existing intellectual monopolies, and in subordinating every single other company in the world. All these services are sold as black boxes. This means that nobody's really learning by doing, using, and interacting, because you use, but you don't get access to the technology. You don't know how those services work. You just know that they work for something, but not how they are working for that something. And this becomes even more relevant when we observe that even rivals of big tech companies depend on their clouds, such as Netflix, Booking, Mercado Libre. And what is changing, therefore, is the role of these user-producer interactions in the production of new innovation. Typically, in the economics of innovation literature, there was this understanding of the user of innovation as also capable of learning by doing, using, and interacting, and by doing that, to innovate more, innovate further. But if you cannot really get access to the technology, your chances to do that will be severely constrained. And you will become structurally a company that depends on those cloud services, because you will not have the capacities to then produce it in-house. So this reinforces intellectual monopoly power for big tech and subordinates a whole set of companies around the world. And that includes, and I will skip the case, but that includes the case of companies even like Siemens. And here it's just showing you how Siemens attempted at one point to develop its own ICT technologies. It failed, and it focused on niche businesses and became a subordinate company to Google. I'm not just claiming, okay, poor Siemens is just a subordinate company. What I'm claiming, and I will finish with this and jump directly to the summary slide, is that firm stratification, which is actually based on unequal access to knowledge and information, is a complex structure. So Siemens subordinates to big tech companies and their clouds because that is essential to then organize its own global value chains and subordinate other companies, such as these ones that you have over here. So we can build here, for instance, on Duquesne's understanding of power, actually as developed through a network of agents, and where one agent accepts to be subordinated is not only because it's best alternative to subordinate, because it has no other chance to some extent to accept to be subordinated. Siemens doesn't have that technological capacity to have a cloud by itself and operate with all those technologies by itself, but also because by subordinating to big tech companies, it enables Siemens to integrate this structure and network in a middle-level position where it can further subordinate others. At the same time, although we can see these networks of corporate power, at the same time, we should also remember that it's not just a complete subordination where subordinate actors, it's not a full domination of actors where, where subordinate actors have no saying. Domination actually is the case where the dominated has no room for reaction or contestation. Whereas these type of power relations that we are observing within the corporate sector, and also eventually they trickle down to worsen workers' conditions, there is still leave a space for contestation. And it's that space of contestation, the one that we should try to also focus on and understand to see the chances of doing things differently. I will skip all this, which is basically how big tech companies are expanding on the basis of this leverage to the healthcare sector, and conclude by saying that when we see pictures like this one that show us the concentration of market capitalization, it's a proxy to some extent of concentration of value, in this case in the digital sector in the US and China, we should always remember that at the same time, and what explains this concentration of value is at least in part the concentration of knowledge and data that is produced around the world, but is concentrated by these companies. And it's not only about the extraction of knowledge and data, but also about the extraction of natural resources that are indispensable for the digital economy. Although we speak a lot about intangibles today, all these intangibles still have a materiality, and this materiality, these digital infrastructures and the devices we use every day require a lot of nature extractivism. So this just to conclude and leave you with with this larger picture to debate all together.